Chapter 3. Evolutionism and the Loss of Human Specificity. The philosophical ramifications of Darwin's theories are so immense that they strike at the most fundamental oppositions at the heart of Western culture, the difference between human and animal, male and female, nature and culture. He reverses a system of signification at least as old as the Greek polis, with whose emergence the images of hybrid and intermediary forms, centaurs, Amazons, Cyclops, were banished to the realms of monstrosity and otherness. With the disappearance of the author from Darwin's universe, these oppositions, which had been elevated virtually to the status of logical categories or necessary ways of thinking about the world, collapsed into a kind of Derridean free play. Margot Norris, Beast of the Modern Imagination, p. 37. In 1884, H.G. Wells came to study at the Normal School of Science in South Kensington, established by T.H. Huxley for the training of science teachers who would staff the new public schools founded after the 1870 Education Act. Though his contact with Huxley was minimal, Wells attended Huxley's lectures for a course on advanced zoology January through June of 1885, and Carrot spoke to him only once. In greeting, Wells fell under Huxley's spell. "I believed then he was the greatest man I was ever likely to meet," he wrote in 1901, "and I believe that all the more firmly today when Wells admired Huxley's commitment to his life's project of explaining for the general public, in both his public lectures and his lucid, readable prose, the importance of a scientific education and the significance of new scientific ideas, most notably evolution theory." Wells would model himself along the same lines, as a champion of Darwin who labored to explain evolutionist science to a popular audience and expounded, with some insistence, even the least palatable implications of evolution theory. As David C. Smith writes in his biography of Wells, Darwin's work brought together a body of thought which produced a world explosion of knowledge. H.G. Wells had grown to manhood in the middle of the first burst of creative energy, and his thinking was to a substantial degree forged in the heat of it. H.G. Wells, pages 50-1. The effect of this world explosion of knowledge in Victorian England, even putting aside the tremendous issue of the challenge Darwinian science posed to religious faith, was to demolish the model of human centrality in the universe, and replace it with one of human ephemerality, relativity, and potential degradation, to use Wells' term. The new discoveries in the geological and biological sciences required a radical rethinking of humanity's position relative to its environment, its intimate relation to lower species, the role of the mere individual within the far more important history of the human species, human insignificance in a world that, according to geology, had existed far longer than previously had been conceived, and that, according to astronomy, occupied a place far more minuscule than previously had been conceived. Not only did the new sciences demolish a comfortable anthropocentrism, but they also problematized the relation between external appearances and internal reality, most notably in the case of the human body. The human being was not the distinctive creature that it appeared to be on the surface. Its lowly origins could be traced by the zoologist, who dissected to find internal structural similarities between human and animal bone, muscle, and tissue, by the embryologist, who posited that ontogeny recapitulated phylogeny, that the human individual passed through its whole history of species evolution during gestation, by the microbiologist, who demonstrated that like all other organisms, humans were, in their most basic components, nothing more than globs of protoplasm. All of these, like the theory of natural selection, accomplished a radical destabilization of what had formerly been a fixed boundary between man and animal. The narrative of Darwinian evolution could be read as a supernaturalist or Gothic one. Evolution theory described the bodily metamorphosis which, even though taking place over eons and over multiple bodies, rendered the identity of the human body in a most basic sense, its distinctness from the brute beasts, unstable. Thus the cultural commonplace of man's bearing the mark of the beast became literalized within scientific discourses, and gave rise to two fears. If humans derived from beasts, then they might still be human entities, not yet fully evolved, not yet fully human. And worse, the evolutionary process might be reversible, the human race might ultimately retrogress into assorted animalism rather than progress towards a telos of intellectual and moral perfection. Various secular popularizers of Darwin, most notably Herbert Spencer, attempted to reformulate evolutionism as a sort of natural progressivism, whereby both living matter and human cultural institutions must inevitably evolve from simple to complex, from barbaric to civilized. Point 2. Even the Anglican Church managed to come to terms with Darwinism in the latter decades of the century by substituting Darwin's theory of natural selection for the idea of divine purpose, so that the human race could still be seen as God's supreme achievement, the perfected product of a biological selection engineered by Providence. Point 3. But figures like Huxley and Wells challenged this glossing of Darwinism, arguing that humanity had come into existence through a random combination of natural processes, and that nature was ethically neutral and under no compulsion to privilege the human species. The human race could not assure itself of its own stability and continuity, for like any other species it could regress into lower forms as well as evolve into higher ones, or simply disappear from the face of the earth. Huxley found some prospect for hope in the fact that nature had, however accidentally, produced a race with an ethical sense, and he argued that human beings must consciously struggle to perpetuate this ethical sense within their species. Wells rejected even this, quite slender, consolation for the loss of the narrative of divinely ordained human purpose. In the 1890s he produced an impressive corpus of work, newspaper and journal articles, short stories, and novels, exploring the physical and moral implications of the evolutionary process. Point 4. These implications were often monstrous. For Wells was impatient with what he saw as a facile belief in humanity's inevitable progress, and its status as the point of culmination within a divinely ordained teleology. In both his fiction and his journalism, Wells exposed the fallacies of the belief in human ascendancy, and emphasized the tentativeness of the human species progress up from savagery. Using their technical phrases and misquoting their authorities in an invincibly optimistic spirit, the educated public has decided that in the past the great scroll of nature has been steadily unfolding to reveal a constantly richer harmony of forms and successively higher grades of being. This belief, as effective, progressive, and pleasing as transformation scenes at a pantomime, receives neither in the geological record nor in the studies of the phylogenetic embryologist any entirely satisfactory confirmation. On the contrary, there is almost always associated with the suggestion of advance in biological phenomena an opposite idea, which is its essential complement, the too sweet harmony of the spheres as age-old be enhanced by a discord, this evolutionary antithesis, degradation, zoological retrogression. P.I. 58.5. The purpose of Wells' evolutionary speculations is always the same, to explore the ideas of human impermanence, imperfection, insignificance, and, most especially degradation, or liability to evolutionary regression. For instance, the duration of life and its follow-up article, Death Saturday Review, 1895, are meditations upon the insignificance of the individual in relation to the species. Wells points out that the business of the animal seems to be, not to live its own life, but to reproduce its own kind, duration, p133, and places the individual human life on the same unenviable scale as that of the lowliest organism. Mortal man and the immortal protozoa have the same barren immortality. The individuals perish, living on only in their descendants, creatures of their body, separated pieces of their undying protoplasm. The type alone persists. Death, p139. The type, however, even the human type, is no more assured of immortality than the individual. On extinction, Chambers Journal. 1893, compares the human species, now in the days of its triumph, with once powerful species long extinct, like the Atlantosaurus, or those teetering on the verge of extinction, like the bison. Though the tone is lyrical, Wells speaks of extinction as a sad but inevitable tragedy of scientific law, p169. The message is as plain as that of a vision of the past. Science Schools Journal, 1887, a rather heavy-handed humorous piece. The author, Henny Smith, awakens into prehistoric times to overhear a monstrous three-eyed amphibian preach to his fellows that their species, the noblest of all beings who have ever existed or ever will exist, represents the culminating point of all existence, pages 155-6. Smith, unable to contain his contempt for these absurd claims made by a creature so inferior to himself in all respects, p156, leaps up, without perceiving the irony of the situation, to inform the misguided congregation that its race is but a preparation for that true culmination, the human species. He then launches into a discourse on the glories of humanity so displeasing to the monsters that he only awakens just in time to avoid being eaten. Vision is a parable about humanity's blindness to its relative inconsequentiality, about human hubris and anthropocentrism, for which Wells, presumably, envisioned an audience as hostile and disbelieving as his man-eating amphibians. For Wells, the strongest argument for the plausibility of human extinction developed in The Rate of Change in Species, Saturday Review, 1894, and Human Evolution, an Artificial Process, Fortnightly Review, 1896, involves humans' limited reproductive capacity. Those species which reproduce themselves rapidly, he reasons, are more likely to survive a major cataclysm than those whose young only come to breeding age every 20 years or so. The latter species bear offspring so relatively seldom that they produce few variations from which they could benefit in the event of such a radical environmental change as a global shift in temperature. Man, like that ungainly and unsuccessful species the Atlantosaurus, is at a strong disadvantage here. His individual adaptability and the subtlety of his contrivance are no doubt great, but his capacity for change as a species is, compared with that of a harvest mouse or a green fly, infinitesimal. Rate of change, p131. Parallel evolutions. For in that backward glance, he had seen the whole deck of the derelict move. With living things, giant rats, thousands and thousands of them, and so in a flash, had come to an understanding of the disappearance of the crew of the bark. Whether they were true ship's rats, or a species that is to be found in the weed-haunted plains and islets of the Sargasso Sea, I cannot say. It may be that they are the descendants of rats that lived in ships long centuries lost in the weed sea, and which have learned to live among the weed, forming new characteristics, and developing fresh powers and instincts. William Hope Hodgson, The Mystery of the Derelict 6. Wells emphasizes not only the human species' weaknesses but also the potential strengths of lesser species. There is no telling into what fearsome forms these more fertile species might evolve. The coming beast must certainly be reckoned in any anticipatory calculations regarding the coming man, he writes in Zoological Retrogression, p168. Other, now humble species may develop into powerful intelligences and supersede humanity, and in Wells' vision, these new species are never benign. This motif occurs again and again in his fiction as well as that of contemporaries like Frank Aubrey, Arthur Conan Doyle, and William Hope Hodgson. The beast may lurk ahead in the future, the monstrous product of some process of evolution no one can now foresee, or it may even now be developing quietly in some dark region of the globe as yet uncharted. Point 7. Wells' short story The Empire of the Ants 8 offers such a scenario. In the jungles of Brazil, a new species of superintelligent ants, possessing advanced social organization and technological skill, takes over Brazil at its least populated center and begins to colonize, killing, and eating the human beings who block its way. What was to prevent the ants evolving also, asked Holroyd, the protagonist. Why should things stop at that any more than man had stopped at the barbaric age? p275. Along similar lines, the Sea Raiders 9 depicts a hitherto unclassified species of cephalopod, Apteuthis rox, that emerges from the depths of the ocean to prey on Cornish bathers and boaters. The Valley of Spiders, 10 a species of giant carnivorous spiders that lurk in the southwestern American desert. Conan Doyle's The Horror of the Heights, a 200-foot glutinous, amoeba-like creature that seizes pilots who venture above 30,000 feet. Point 11. Gillian Beer writes that Darwin's theories, with their emphasis on superabundance and extreme fecundity, reached out towards the grotesque. Nature was seen less as husbanding than as spending. Hyperproductivity authenticated the Fantastic 12. In other words, natural selection was a scenario within which any morphic configuration, however implausible, was a plausible one, for nature rewarded variety and changefulness rather than inflexibility of form. To shift Beer's term slightly, natural selection authenticated the fantastic. Darwin's narrative proved to be an extraordinarily fertile source for Gothic plotting, which in turn placed its phantasmic entities within an explicitly evolutionist or pseudo-evolutionist framework. In The Terror of Blue John Gap, for instance, Conan Doyle's narrator concludes his description of an encounter with a subterranean monster as follows. My view is, that in this part of England there is a vast subterranean lake or sea, which is fed by the great number of streams which pass down through the limestone. Where there is a large collection of water there must also be some evaporation, mists or rain, and a possibility of vegetation. This in turn suggests that there may be animal life, arising, as the vegetable life would also do, from those seeds and types which had been introduced at an early period of the world's history, when communication with the outer ear was more easy. This place had then developed a fauna and flora of its own, including such monsters as the one I had seen, which may well have been the old cave bear, enormously enlarged and modified by its new environment. Pages 85-6. 13. The protagonist of Phil Robinson's The Man-Eating Tree, 1881. 14. Posits a sort of polymorphous evolutionary potential to all organic life, whereby any organism is capable of drastic readaptation to environmental circumstances. Since the sensual instincts of beast and vegetable are manifestly analogous, one should not be surprised to discover vegetable species remaking themselves as both percipient and sentient. p3. He notes ominously that the vegetable world has its revenges. P5-15. Gothic stories of parallel evolution represent anomalous phenomena. Monsters are properly biological sports, as logical products of natural processes. Monstrosities which disturb the taxonomies of natural history are, paradoxically, legitimate by the Darwinian version of natural history, and in Gothic natural history, the anomalous is reframed as the normal. Inert matter takes on life, vegetable species become mobile, and both these as well as non-human animal species acquire sentience, no longer the exclusive property of humans. As the human loses its particularity, it also begins to be evacuated of its meaningfulness. A Darwinian nature does not privilege, indeed takes no particular notice of, the human species. In the empire of the ants, Holroyd, traveling down the Amazon in a small boat, is oppressed by its inhospitality, wildness, and immensity of the South American jungle. He had suddenly discovered the insignificance of man. He began to perceive that man is indeed a rare animal, having but a precarious hold upon the land. P270. He consumed human body. One of the great leaves of the flytrap, that had been shut and touching the ground as it lay, was slowly rolling back upon its hinges. There, lying like a child in its cradle, was Alabama Joe in the hollow of the leaf. The great thorns had been slowly driven through his heart as it shut upon him. It had closed on him as you've seen your little hothouse once do on a fly, and there he were as we found him, torn and crushed into pulp by the great jagged teeth of the man-eaten plant. Conan Doyle, The American's Tale 16. But the empire of the ants and other stories that speculate on the possibilities of evolution go a step further and represent an actively hostile nature, the Gothicized nature, that threatens to draw in and engulf the human observer. The especial terror ascribed to these monstrous non-human species lurking within the natural landscape is that they prey on human flesh, and that those beings with super-evolved intelligences, like Holroyd's ants or the Martians in Wells' The War of the Worlds, 1898, regard humankind as inferior brutes further down the evolutionary scale and thus further down the food chain. The narrator of War of the Worlds finds himself oppressed by a sense of dethronement, a persuasion that I was no longer a master, but an animal among the animals, under the Martian heel. With us it would be as with the animals, to lurk and watch, to run, and hide 17 humans, in becoming prey, become things. Texts like Conan Doyle's The American's Tale and Aubrey's The Deviltry of El Dorado, both feature man-eating plants, like Robinson's story, depict in repulsive detail half-eaten bodies, or the agonies of dying people as they are being preyed upon. In Wells' The Sea Raiders, a character named Feason sees, from a distance, what he first imagines to be a cluster of birds fighting over a fragment of food that caught the sun and glistened pinkish white. As Feason approaches nearer to the object, the story engages the reader in a long tease as the fragment of food becomes gradually more distinct, and finally reveals itself to be the partially devoured body of a human being, covered over with the gleaming bodies and tentacles of half a dozen cephalopods, pages 652-3. Here the human body is sheerly corporeal, indistinguishable from other raw matter as it is rent and fragmented and absorbed into the viscous body of its predator. Slimy-bodied anthropophagi like the cephalopod are favored in the Gothic literature of parallel evolution. 18 Human objects of prey are alerted by a track of slime to the presence of their as yet unseen predators in Weatherby Chesney's The Crimson Beast, 1898, Carrot and Hodgson's The Boats of the Glen Carrick. Wells' giant spiders travel in floating colonies that are vast, soft, ragged, filmy things resembling an aerial jellyfish, P838. Robinson's man-eating tree glistens with a sticky dew, P10. All of the life forms that Conan Doyle's aviator finds in the upper air are greasy and protoplasmic in texture, and the thing that chases him looks and moves like an amoeba, a gigantic version of the hungry one described by Allman. Its method of progression was to throw out a long, glutinous streamer in front of it, which in turn seemed to draw forward the rest of the writhing body. So elastic and glutinous was it that never for 2 successive minutes was it the same shape. Cujoic as a flash there shot out a long tentacle from this mass of floating blubber. A long, gliding, sticky, serpent-like coil came from behind and caught me round the waist. The horror of the heights, P25-6. The viscosity of the predatory natural world may be said to represent the suchness of matter, as it gains sentience and rises up to swallow the bounded human world. But it was not properly a man. And at the 6th fire hole, I did see that which I did think to be a great man, that did sit to the fire, with monstrous knees drawn upward unto his chin. And the nose was great and bent downward, and the eyes very large, and did shine with the light from the fire hole, and moved, watching, always this way and that, so that the white parts did show, now this side and now that. But it was not properly a man. Hodgson, The Kiteland, 20. But a slimy amorphousness also characterizes the human, who can be reduced to the slime from which he came, and forced to put on the flesh of the reptile and the snake. When the rash Professor Gregg of the 3 impostors speaks the mystic words inscribed upon an ancient Celtic stone, something pushed out from the body of the epileptic boy there on the floor, and stretched forth, a slimy, wavering tentacle, across my room, P299. The invertebrate or reptile is depicted here as a human ancestor whose loathsome characteristics still lie latent within the human body. As Gregg explains, human flesh may now and then, once perhaps in 10 million cases, be the veil of powers which seem magical to us, powers which, so far from proceeding from the heights and leading men thither, are in reality survivals from the depths of being. The amoeba and the snail have powers which we do not possess, and I thought it possible that the theory of reversion might explain many things which seem wholly inexplicable. P293. The motif of human devolution occurs again and again in the fin de siècle Gothic, sometimes as a means of literalizing the biastiness of which humans are capable, sometimes as a means of demonstrating the cruel randomness of motiveless nature. In the Mackin passage, humans are both imperfectly evolved, always already abhuman, continuous with their beastly ancestors, and liable to reversion to a still worse state of abhumanness, even to utter indifferentiation. Within this scenario, man is not simply threatened by the coming beast. He is the coming beast, and has been all along. In human evolution, an artificial process, Wells, considering the disadvantages of humanity's limited reproductive capacity on its own terms, argues that the species could have benefited from such an insignificant amount of modification through natural selection in the last 10,000 years that it can hardly have undergone anything but an infinitesimal alteration in its intrinsic nature since the age of unpolished stone, P214. He scoffs at the notion that any sort of ethical sense could have been bred into the species over a few centuries. The evolution of ideas and moral systems must be considered separately, and is distinct from natural evolution undergone through selection of the fittest and subsequent modification. In other words, urgent rage and sexual desire, the love of hunting and killing, are still as strong in civilized humanity as they were in Stone Age peoples. The civilized person only keeps these strong emotions in check through the artificial devices of social breeding and education. In the artificial man, we have all that makes the comforts and securities of civilization a possibility. What we call morality becomes the padding of suggested emotional habits necessary to keep the round Paleolithic savage in the square hole of the civilized state. And sin is the conflict of the two factors, as I have tried to convey in my Island of Dr. Morrow. p. 217, though Wells rejects the idea of God, he retains a definition of sin as a fall from a state of grace, a lapse from humanity to bestiality that signals, to those who care to discern, humans' imperfect evolution from the state of savagery. Wells rejects as well the belief which comforted Huxley, that the human species has managed biologically to evolve such attributes as a moral sense. He argues on the one hand that significant moral evolution has not actually occurred, and on the other that significant evolutionary change may still take us backwards, in a direction opposite to that we conceive as progress. Evolution, he reminds his reader in zoological retrogression, has no favorites. Its only criterion for success is adaptive capability in response to environment and no telos which involves human values or self-interest. Higher faculties such as intellectual capacity and morality are good for only as long as they last, since regression to a lower form may at some time be a more proper response to environmental change than progression to a higher. And humans are no more exempt from regression than any lower form. The presumption is that before humanity lies a long future of profound modification, but whether that will be, according to present ideals, upward or downward, no one can forecast. p. 168.